What if everything you thought you knew about near-death experiences was a lie? For centuries, stories of heaven, hell, and the afterlife have captivated millions. But are all of these experiences truly divine? Or is there something more sinister at work? Are you prepared to uncover the truth? The NDE Conspiracy, available May 6th, 2025.
Welcome back. It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show. This is another episode in my ongoing series where I am letting friends of mine hijack the podcast. Today, my good friend Heidi Barr is going to be taking over the show and interviewing me about my brand new book, The NDE Conspiracy. Heidi, you now own the microphone. Take it away.
Thank you, Shaun. I am so glad to be here, and we've reversed roles. This is my first interview. You are always the interviewer. Now you get to be the interviewee. And I'm so excited when you sent me a draft of your book, and I have notes. So if I look away, apologize to your viewers. The NDE Conspiracy. I happened to be traveling, and I was in a hotel, couldn't sleep, so I read it until 2 a.m, and I was enthralled and fascinated. So and I have this. See, it comes up backwards. That's what I was afraid it would do. I know it's not available yet, but I do know it's available for pre-sale because I checked that out and I'm really excited to order it. But I do have a question, and this is my question. Why this book? Why now?
Isn't that the question, I think?
That is the question.
It's been an interesting journey to spend the past 7 years playing in the near-death experience space as a non-experiencer. The majority of the people who write and do ministry in this space, like yourself, have had a near-death experience. And then there's a few of us like myself and John Burke who we write and we play in this space, but we're not experiencers. And so I think my naive assumption and again, I work in Christian publishing, so I've worked on a bunch of books with Randy Kay and other near-death experience related books. But my assumption coming into this space is it was all typical heaven and hell near-death experience kind of testimonies. And if you stay in kind of that narrow road of the publishing genre I'm in, that is the case. It's very much that. But one of the things I discovered as I read more broadly, and again, I realized there was a whole vocabulary and language in this space. There's a lot of research that's happening with medical doctors and other kinds of scientists and people really just like we are. They're trying to make sense of it through their own worldview lens or their grid of how they try to make sense of the world. But the further you go down that rabbit hole and the more broadly you read, you soon discover that it's not all heaven and hell, like let's encounter Jesus kind of testimonies. There's a bunch of goofy stuff, as I like to say, that could steer you down some really dark paths. And it can range from somebody having an overt deception happen in the midst of their experience, like our friend Brian Melvin. This is probably one of my favorite cases of a very overt, obvious deception happening during his near-death experience. He finds himself in a place that looks very much like the house where he grew up as a child, and a few things are out of place, but like it feels like familiar territory. And then, these people start coming up and saying, "Oh, Brian, we're so glad you're here. Welcome. We're so glad you're here." Like a welcoming committee, as we would expect in a typical heaven near-death experience. And then something was off. He started to see somebody that looked like his mom. And he was like, "My mom isn't dead. Why would she be here welcoming me?" And that's when the scenario completely shifted, and what looked like human beings or the souls of loved ones in heaven welcoming him, all of a sudden it switched, and they turned into these serpent-like demonic kind of creatures, and one of them eventually leads him down into hell. And so Brian would tell you if he'd been resuscitated in the early part of that experience, he would have thought he was fine. He would have thought, "I'm going to go to heaven just like I did last time I died." And so that was really my first encounter with an overt deception happening in the midst of a near-death experience. And that planted the seed in my mind for this book of, is there other kinds of deception? And there's also near-death experience accounts that people will share where it's not maybe like Brian's was, where it looks like it's a heaven experience, but it'll be people are encountered this nondescript, what they think is God. They'll say, "I was this ball of light and it was just love." and I was in everything, and everything was in me, and everybody goes to have like a lot of it's like pantheism and universalism and just really poor theology, things that are in opposition to what we read in the Bible. I actually share a specific account in the book of a woman who was having some kind of a surgical procedure and died because of too much anesthesia or something like that. And she encounters this ball of light and what she thinks is God. And this being actually tells her that things like cannibalism and rape and murder, they're really okay. And it's just like soul growth and preparation for the other side. And I feel like you don't need even half a moral compass to be like, that's a little bit off. Like those things are evil and bad. I don't even feel like we need to argue about that. So, Brian's example, I would say, is like an overt deception happening in the midst of an NDE. I feel like those other kinds of encounters are a little bit more covert, where people, they think they're encountering God, but God is nondescript and vague, versus so many of the near-death experiences like yours and Randy's, when people encounter Jesus or the Father or even the Holy Spirit, it's very clear who you're interacting with. Like God's being very intentional to reveal himself to people. And then further past that, we get into the stuff that I think has, I feel like with Satan's intention, kind of bolted itself onto the side of near-death experiences and this whole space. I went to a large international conference last summer, and probably 10% of the content was like hell and heaven testimonies. The rest of it was mediums talking about how they help people get in touch with their lost loved ones, or people talking about UFO alien abduction encounters and how they're very much like and relate to near-death experiences, or people talking about pre and past life memories. And so, what historically I think had been a discussion of people trying to get to come to terms with like the medical reasons and make sense of these things spiritually. It's now this smorgasbord of consciousness related things. And, some of these other things that I, on the other side of the fence, I feel like they could lead you into deception, destruction, lead you away from Jesus. And so, yeah, that's kind of how the concept was born. People's eternal destination, where they will be for eternity. That's really what's at stake here.
Yes.
And nobody on our side of the fence or in the Christian publishing space has necessarily talked about these things. And so Randy and I have been talking about somebody needed to write a book like this for the last 5 years. And so finally I decided I would do it. So that's how we got here.
I really do understand, because when I was reading the book, it occurred to me let's say when I died, I had come back into my body without meeting God. Let's say I had been above my body. I'd been perfectly fine. I was perfectly fine. I knew I was dead. I didn't care. What if I had come back into my body without meeting Jesus? I would have thought, oh, all things go to heaven. It's all good. It's all cool. That's the awareness I would have been left with. And I would have been able to interpret it any way I wanted to. When you meet Jesus, there is an entirely different interpretation. You take an entirely different route. Now, could you talk a little bit about the scientific studies done on ESP or cosmic consciousness? If you remember Carl Jung, I think, what did Carl Jung call it? The cosmic unconsciousness, or this shared sort of cosmic soul or awareness. And I do know that there are a number of studies going on around the world. One is the Division of Perceptual Studies at UVA, University of Virginia. They've been studying near-death experiences for quite a while, and they've branched out into the study of reincarnation. I would love to hear your take on this, and even on now. I'm not sure which conference you went to. There, I do know how IONS was originally formed, and I do not remember what IONS stands for. I remember when they were originally formed decades ago, and I think that's a little bit. They've branched out into a few other areas than just near-death experiences, but would love to hear your take on any and all of these areas of perceptual studies.
Yeah, in terms of IANDS, it's International Association of Near-Death Studies, and it was founded by medical doctors, and I feel like that guided a lot of the early ground covered. And it's really, I think, in the last 10 to 20 years, you've seen this shift, not just with that organization, but across the whole space of all this other stuff getting added into the mix. It is a bit of a brain teaser to start wrestling with the idea of reincarnation and what do we do with past life memories. I mean,
Mhm.
honestly, I didn't even realize this space was part of the conversation until Randy and I, whether it was pioneering or foolish, we did an interview with a mom who had a son who had a past life memory experience, and so we you know, at this point, I almost say foolishly because our audience was not pleased. But we read the book and had a conversation, and her son remembered being this famous baseball player effectively, and had all these detailed memories of riding on trains with playing against Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and all the things. And there was a book made from that story. And Randy's audience, got a little heated and were like, you're preaching reincarnation, you shouldn't be having these kinds of conversations. And so Randy and I together never went that route. In terms of another interview, I feel like I can get away with a little bit different conversations as a non-experiencer, but that was really my first exposure. I really hadn't realized that was part of this discussion space. And a lot of people would point to the past life memories and say, well, that's proof for reincarnation. And what do we do with that? You mentioned the University of Virginia, their Department of Perceptual Studies. For over 50 years, they've been documenting and researching and studying these past life memories. They typically happen with children who are between the ages of 2 and 5. And when they're around 7, these memories start to fade. And so, one of the things a lot of us realize is that when we're young children, we're very open spiritually. Like I share in the opening part of the book that I had this haunted house experience when I was pre-elementary age, and I saw what I thought were ghosts at the time, but now I would come to understand them as demons in that space. And I think part of the reason I could see that is because I was so young. Nobody else in the house could see those sorts of things. And so in the case of these past life memories, I feel like children, because they're spiritually open, they are able to receive these things. And I think the question we have to wrestle with is, what do we do with this? Because these are at times legitimate memories of real people that have actually lived. I mean, this is documented and researched. It's worth noting with the research that the Department of Perceptual Studies does, a lot of their research is happening in countries outside of the West, where a belief in reincarnation, faith-wise, is normal. And so I'm not necessarily surprised that you would get more of these kinds of cases coming out of those areas. But what do we do with that? If we have a Christian worldview where, we live once, we die, our soul passes over to the other side, and, we enter into our afterlife experience. If it's not, if reincarnation is not a real end of life destination, then what do we do with these past life memories? Because there's plenty of thousands and thousands of these documented. In the book, I look at both near death experiences and past life memories. Historically, these things have been documented and shared for thousands of years. The case I make in the book is that for whatever reason, in some of these kind of dark side paths we find in the NDE space, people find themselves a few rungs up what I would refer to as the demonic activity ladder. So if you read widely in like the exorcism and deliverance spaces, there's usually kind of a four steps or I say a 4-rung ladder of infestation, oppression, obsession, and then full-on possession. In the cases of the past life memories, the hypothesis I'm putting out there is that for some reason, these people find themselves several rungs up that ladder, whether they live in a place where something evil happened that has attracted demonic spirits, or there's something in their family line. It could even be like a curse, or something has attracted demons to manifest in this way. And I would argue to manifest through these children, because what is very similar is this idea of familiar spirits. And so again, this leans into the exorcism and deliverance space, but it's a very common story that you'll hear in a lot of different books of somebody will be manifesting a demon, and the demon will be masquerading as the lost soul of a boy or girl who was murdered back in the 1800s, and they can't depart this world until you help solve their murder or this or that. It's a wild goose chase. And so that is spiritually, as I try to think through my worldview lens, that is the closest correlation I could find. And so, my argument is that for whatever reason, there's some demonic activity happening there that's trying to bring, while it may be the life of a legitimate person, demons have been around for thousands of years. They've observed us. They know how we work. And so at the end of the day, I feel like the past life memories is a strong push for reincarnation. I feel like that is the intention, and it's meant to be a distraction from, people actually encountering Jesus and pursuing a relationship with him, which in turn could, get you to, hopefully will get you to heaven.
Yes.
But yeah, so I mean, it's a strange phenomenon, and again, there's lots of research on it. But again, I feel like it's a distraction meant to lead you down a path away from the Christian faith.
In a sense, what you're describing is a leap of faith that requires a belief in a demonic world, in demons, in a world, in an unseen world, a world we don't normally see. And I've often said, because I have children and grandchildren, I've often said kids' brains are very soft. They're not hardened yet. Kids' brains are really open and receptive, and they can see things we don't necessarily see. They might, they might, in a child's mind, like for instance, my kids were raised with dogs. They could bark as well as my dog could bark. Their minds are very soft. They identify with the dog as well as they identify with a sibling. A dog is a person to them. So it does require, and this is actually the scary side of the unseen world. I kind of tend to avoid this for the most part, because for me, I would rather have my kids watch bad words, listen to bad words on a movie than listen to ever see a horror movie with demons. That is how strongly I feel about this. My kids were never allowed to watch those kinds of movies, because I feel, and I would like to know how you feel about this, pursuing it with the wrong intention, or with even sometimes innocent intentions, can open you up to demonic attack. What are your thoughts about that?
I would say we have to take that on our own individual case by case basis.
Mm-hmm.
I got to interview a practicing medium for my podcast a while back. He's a very well known name in the near death experience space. He's written multiple books. One of his books is quite good. And so I wanted to interview him because I like some of the research he has in his book. And I got a lot of flack for that from some of my prophetic friends, like, oh man, you shouldn't be giving that guy a platform. You shouldn't even be talking with that kind of a person. And so, I would say if you're going to start rubbing shoulders with people in this space, maybe make sure it's more of your calling or a directions God is leading you. Like, God is bigger than Satan and demons, but you are getting into dark spaces. And so you do have to be prayed up and having your intercessors like praying and interceding for you and all those things. We need to be wise. But at the same time, I feel like we can't be afraid of bringing light into dark spaces. My hope with that conversation is the people who enjoy that man's work would find my podcast and listen to my interview with you or my interview with Randy and check out some of our other content that points people to Jesus. But like I do get into this in the book in terms of like psychics and mediums. Like I explain kind of what they are, how they differ. Mediums are very much a huge part of the near-death experience space. There were a bunch of them at the conference I was at last summer. Some of them were keynoting and sharing about their work. One of the challenges you face with mediums is they do not obviously operate from a Christian worldview.
Yes.
They would tell you that demons aren't real. That in their worldview, they're not real. They believe they, have these spirit guides who are just out of the kindness of whatever are there to help them communicate with the other side. They would tell you that they think the beings that they're manifesting or channeling to communicate with these people, that it is actually the lost souls of these departed loved ones and that sort of thing. So I think some of those folks have good intentions and they feel like they're doing good. One of the challenges I think you see with this space, and if again leaning back into the exorcism and deliverance space, I've interviewed a lot of folks that do ministry there and have read tons of books in that space. It's a very common story for somebody to consult a psychic or a medium and then all of a sudden have all these dark things start happening in their life, like demons manifesting in their home and all kinds of just crazy like stuff leading you in a bad direction start to happen, start to manifest. And so again, we like somebody doing an interview or having conversations with those folks, not as worried about that. But when you're consulting psychics and mediums in place of God, in place of prayer. If you want to speed up answers, that sort of a thing. I think we can look at Saul and the witch or necromancer at Endor, and it's a fascinating case study because Israel has banned consulting necromancers or mediums. The punishment for that is death. Clearly, the king of Israel would know that, and you have the king of Israel impatient because he can't get a hold of Samuel anymore because he's dead, and the medium is concerned that Saul even shows up. What's fascinating about that account, though, when you read in the Bible, it talks about how she screams when Samuel shows up, and reading different commentaries on that, I think she was expecting her spirit guide to show up, and here Samuel somehow comes through. A lot of the commentators say, and so however God allowed that, that's I don't quite understand that. But at the end of the day, Saul ends up dying in that battle right after that, and that's what he was trying to consult Samuel about. So rather than wait on God and pray and be patient, he took matters into his own hands, which was something you saw all throughout his life as an issue. And are you necessarily going to die just because you consulted a psychic or a medium? Not necessarily. But again, if we read in the Bible that this sort of thing is forbidden and warned against, we probably should take that into some of our decision making. And I get the appeal. Like it's cool to, people think it's cool to get this kind of intel and insight and secret knowledge and special information. I understand the appeal, but it is playing with darkness. And so I think it's one thing if you're interacting in a research and interview capacity, or going to a conference where some of these folks might be speaking. It's a completely different thing if we're consulting those sorts of people for like information and special knowledge, because then we're kind of coming under their authority, which is where I think you open that gateway to the demonic in your life.
I always thought that biblical story of Saul and Samuel was very powerful because Samuel was so angry that's at what Saul had done, that he'd awakened him from his sleep and he told him the truth. You're going to die. And as I recall, the Bible does have injunctions about trying to reach into the spirit world, trying to take these shortcuts. And it doesn't say because you are so evil, but it says because you may inadvertently let evil into this world. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're playing with. I remember once when I was in college, I was friends with a Native American medicine man, wonderful person. He was Christian and a medicine man. And he said to me, light, just like moths are attracted to a light or a flame, darkness is attracted to the light it sees in people. So even people who are very godly, sometimes he said, especially people who are very godly, they put out this light. They have a bright light. They shine brightly with the light of God. Darkness is attracted to that. And when I was reading your book, that's what I thought of, that there is a spirit world now. Yes, indeed. It is all under God. God is in charge, and God is far more powerful than any of the dark side will ever know or understand. God is always, he's always one step ahead of them. So I understand that. But as human beings, we're very vulnerable. Now, I'm really interested in this because when I was in Israel, I saw what I can only describe as an unidentified flying object, a UFO. And I was with a friend. It was night. In Israel, there were no lights at the time. So it was really, really dark. You could see the whole Milky Way. And I saw a UFO. You mention UFOs in your book. I would love you to tell your audience about this, what you have to say about the UFO phenomenon.
Yeah, that was maybe a rabbit hole I didn't expect to go down in the book. But referring back to that conference I was at last year, I sat in on a number of sessions where people were contrasting these UFO abduction experiences with near-death experiences and asking the questions, well, are these the same thing? Why are they similar? And I was like, well, that's interesting. Like, I didn't expect that to be at the forefront of the discussions happening in the NDE space, but it is a very popular part of what people are talking about. I was like, I got to figure out how to address that in the book. At face value, I was like, this, I don't even know how this is going to work. And so I really prayed about it as I was working through that chapter. And I feel like God gave me an insight, and I was like, okay, I share that 9-point framework in the opening part of the book about like the different stages of a near death experience. And so I briefly referenced like 4 or 5 like well-known UFO abduction accounts in the book, and I do my best to sort of process them within my framework. And as I thought through each of the accounts I shared in the book, I began to realize, oh, this is interesting. Like they score like a 5 or a 6 out of 9, in terms of the things you expect to happen in a near-death experience. You could have a loose correlation into what's happening. And I don't think they're the same thing as a near death experience per se, because these people who have these experiences, they're not near death, they're not sick typically. Like this happens. But and I lost my train of thought for a second. Where was I going to go?
Wait, you were talking about how the near death experience correlates, or how people sometimes think the UFO abduction experience may correlate with the near death experience, and people are wondering what is the source of this, or you were at this conference.
Yeah, and so what's interesting to note is there are hundreds of documented cases where these experiencers are in the midst of this traumatic PTSD-inducing experience, and they'll call out to Jesus, and the experiences they'll stop in a moment. And that's a pretty common testimony. So I feel like that tells us there's a spiritual root. There's likely a demonic root there. But I would at the very least say it's a spiritual transformative experience. So it's not really an NDE, because again, they're not sick, they're not near death. But a spiritual transformative experience is an otherworldly experience, if you will, where you're not dying, you're not near death, but you may have lots of things happen that are almost beat by beat what somebody experiences in a near-death experience. I think these abduction encounters could also be in that space. I pose this in the book, interestingly. It's just something to think about. Like talking with various prophetic folks that I hang out with in my ministry and publishing work, they've talked about seeing beings in the spirit that they're not sure if they're like watchers or like high-ranking angels or something, but they look like the weird bug-eyed gray aliens. And so they've kind of wrestled with that. Like, what do we do? Like, God, what is that? What do we do with that? And so, that's just an interesting aside that they saw something that looked very much like the typical alien that people say shows up in these UFO encounters. I think you have to differentiate between like UFOs and unidentified flying objects and the alien abductions. Like they go together, but they're not always the same thing, because you can just see something whiz by and you're like, wow, that was probably a UFO. And then there's somebody who's in the midst of one of these experiences. And so I think the tell there is, again, the folks who have cried out to Jesus and the experience stops. A lot of times with these things that are, not within kind of the purview of the typical experience, there's usually some kind of a tell that could give you an indicator that it's demonic, or there's a dark presence at work because the ideas that people are coming back with. And again, in the book, I liken it to, for some reason, has somebody stepped into a space where they find themselves several rungs up that ladder of demonic activity. And again, you'd have to research it and understand more of their family history, their life, their spiritual state, all these things to try to really come to terms with what that is. But with these different things, there's definitely a spiritual component, and I think a demonic component. And the whole UFO abduction thing, it is a bunny trail to lead you down into all kinds of craziness. Like people obsess over these things, and so in some ways, not unlike the near-death experience stories and testimonies, it's interesting, it's fascinating, and there's nothing wrong with being intrigued or learning about these things. But again, it's just stuff that's going to lead you into places that aren't necessarily going to lead you to Jesus. So I feel like it could be a real distraction to people where, they're just kind of going off into the sunset thinking about other things.
Well, you're basically describing it as a red herring.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, our focus, and I love the fact that you say there's a tell. If people call out to Jesus, the experience stops. That's the greatest tell of all. That shows me that, well, like I said, when I saw a UFO, I was with my friend and we saw something in the sky. We didn't know what it was, so we ran back to our cabin. We didn't want to know what it was. So that's just an unidentified flying object. I have no idea what it was. An alien abduction is completely different. Let me, if you don't mind, I want to look at my notes for a sec, because you actually, I have a breakdown of your chapter titles. Chapter 1 is the best title I have ever read in any book in my life. All my friends went to heaven and all I got was this stupid t-shirt. I hope you're going to print these up because I want one of those t-shirts.
I do have a hoodie that says that, except it's, all I got was this stupid hoodie. I am getting those made, so I will have those on in my merch store in the not too distant future. But that's kind of how it's felt. I mean, I say that, John Burke and I need that t-shirt when we speak at events because, it's just fascinating being a non-experiencer when, I know dozens and dozens and dozens of experiencers. Like, I'm very close with many of you who have had these afterlife experiences. And so I feel like it brings a little humor into what is a very weighty space, like sharing these testimonies and helping to steward these testimonies. Like, it's an important work that we're all doing. But I whether it's the chapter titles or some of the headings within the chapter, I really tried to inject my sense of humor and my personality into it, which I know you picked up on as you read the book.
Yeah, I loved it because some of your material's dark. So I needed that humor to keep me from saying, oh, I don't know if I want to read this. No, your personality shone through in every chapter and you were able to give both sides of an issue. Now, a lot of the dark side is fascinating. We talked about this just before we began recording. Horror movies fascinate people. Slasher movies fascinate people. The dark side of life fascinates people. And sometimes it fascinates people even more than the lighter side of life. Even more, it actually holds more fascination, which is odd from my perspective, than God. Would you be willing to discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, I think this is one of the deceptions of Satan, if you will. Darkness can be attractive, or I feel like a lot of it though is, and maybe it's the same as the temptation one was in the garden of, learning something new or something special or something that we don't yet understand. And so I feel like that is the temptation to dabble in darkness or to watch horror movies. Like I'm very well read with Ed and Lorraine Warren, who are well-known demonologists from, they were kind of some of the grandparents of the paranormal discussion and research space. And I've watched the various Conjuring movies that are based on their stories. They don't really scare me. I just want to see how they adapted the stories. But I do think we do need to be careful of like what we take in, what we read, what we view. Some of my friends watch horror movies and it doesn't bother them. Other people are very spiritually disturbed based on how sensitive they are. And so I feel like to some degree it's a case by case basis. As somebody who's read widely again in like the exorcism and deliverance space, if there's a popular movie, I tend to want to watch it because I want to understand what is the worldview that is being presented. How is the interaction between like pastors, priests, clergy, and the demons being shown in that sort of a film? Because people do largely base a lot of their worldview ideas on popular media and TV shows and movies. And so it is important for us who are ministering and writing and working in these sorts of dark spaces to understand what culture is saying, how culture is trying to steer the conversation, because a lot of times it's upside down and backwards. It's not biblical, or it's not. Often shows God or the pastor or the priest as smaller than Satan and his demons, and so there is a dark intent to, I feel like, make Satan bigger and make God smaller in a lot of the media and content that's put out there today. And so, again, not necessarily bad to interact with that stuff, but I have heard testimonies from exorcists who, have had to do ministry with people who, the gateway into the demonic showing up in their life was some kind of a horror movie. And so why it affects one person and not another person, I can't say for sure. But I would say you pray about it. If the Holy Spirit says no, you're too sensitive, don't watch that stuff. Don't watch that stuff. If you're again at the forefront of media and culture and these sorts of discussions, it can be important to understand what culture is saying. So I guess walk gently and figure out how the Lord leads you on that.
With that answer, I'm going to segue into something related, which is just as people become really obsessed with watching horror movies or the dark side, a lot of people, and I know this because I do a lot of interviews, a lot of people become obsessed with NDEs. Instead of, try to put it this way, instead of looking at God, they're looking at the person who experienced the NDE. And everyone's experience is somewhat different, and not all of them are reality based. So could you talk about that, about the danger of, because you talk about that in your book, the danger of being too focused on the NDE story itself instead of what it's pointing, the person it is pointing to.
Yeah, and that's a danger, because I think people want to set up you or Randy or somebody else who's had a near-death experience as kind of a guru because you've been to the other side. So clearly you must have all the answers that I need about heaven, hell, and the afterlife. And John Burke in his book Imagine Heaven makes a statement where basically he says, we need to weigh these things against what we read in Scripture, and but what we read in the Bible, has way more weight than Randy's testimony or Heidi's testimony. We shouldn't be setting up the Church of Heidi and Randy or something where we base these massive theological ideas solely off of your experience. And so, we really need to take in the meat and spit out the bones from any of these kinds of accounts. We should weigh these things against what we read in Scripture, what we know as Orthodox historic Christian teaching. If things fall outside of those, it falls outside of what we'd expect to see in the typical stages of an NDE, it's okay to have questions and question it. It's okay to pray about it and ask the Holy Spirit for discernment about, like, this one leaves me a little uncomfortable. But there's nothing wrong with enjoying these stories. Clearly I do, working in this space, but I feel like people can get to a place where they just binge watch all these near-death experience testimonies, but there's not really anything shifting or changing in their life. Maybe their faith is bolstered for the afterlife. But one of the biggest, I feel like, misses we can have is if we're not telling people about Jesus. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping as I continue to work in this space and, working on future books with experiencers like yourself, is just to be sure that we're not just giving somebody a testimony of a heaven or hell experience, that we're also, telling them about Jesus, giving them an opportunity to accept Jesus. I even include a gospel presentation at the end of this book. And it's been a miss in a lot of like the movies and like documentary kind of content that's happening in this space, where it does everything except tell you about Jesus, which is pretty critical in terms of whether you're going to go to heaven or hell, what your afterlife experience is going to be like. And I feel like there's just an opportunity for those of us who, want to make sure that's a critical component of all the conversations having this space, to produce books and media where Jesus is at the forefront. It's not making the experiencer bigger, brighter, and more beautiful. It's making Jesus bigger, brighter, and more beautiful. And again, I think for people that get excited, I don't think they're necessarily doing anything wrong. It's again, I think just obsessing about these things, it can be a distraction. And so, it's to be good to be mindful of producing content that is going to tell people about Jesus, because it's a very common story. If you go to a conference, I went to the secular conference and Randy K's Heaven conference, like back to back, 1 week, one, the other week, the next. And I encountered people and had conversations with folks who said the same things to me. They said, I lost a loved one, grandma died, somebody died, and I was hurting and I was sad and I wanted to know that they were okay. So I started Googling and searching on YouTube. And some people would say they found content that led them to that secular organization and that conference and those folks having those conversations. I had other people tell me the same thing and say they found Randy's in my content and they heard about Jesus. I even had people say they found stuff that put them in touch with like mediums and all kinds of stuff on the darker side. And then they found Randy's in my content and they realized that stuff was bad. And so, it's really that thing that people's eternal destination, where they spend eternity, is in the balance. And it can be as simple as a Google search or a YouTube search that led them down that dark path. And so I feel like that's why it's really important to have these conversations about that. All experiences are not equal. Just because somebody says, or something that somebody encountered in an experience said it was God, it doesn't mean it was, or that those were great theological ideas to take home and start sharing with others. And that is, I feel like, kind of the danger in our space is, just because somebody had an experience, it doesn't mean they're sharing biblical ideas or Jesus-centric ideas. And, I hope this book can be kind of a desk reference or something to keep on your nightstand as you're watching YouTube videos or reading NDE books and go, oh, I remember in Shaun's book, he talked about this. Like, oh, what are the questions I should ask about, is this good? Is this bad? Like, where does this fall? And so I hope this book really just opens people up that, that it's not all sunshine, unicorns, and rainbows in the NDE discussion space. There's light and there's dark, or there's light and there's dark. And, let's take in what's good from the light and reject what's coming from the dark.
When I read the book, I realized it was a reference book. It was essentially an encyclopedia. It was a step-by-step sort of instructional guide or manual for how to interpret near-death experiences and how to interpret the other associated spiritual genres or mediums or anything associated with near-death experiences. And was that your intention? You wanted to write a reference book, a guidebook? Was that what you had planned from the beginning?
I think that materialized in the process. As you know, with writing any book, it ends up not where you thought you were going to go when it started. But I think I wrote the book I would have loved to have read when I started in this space 7 years ago, where I didn't realize there were frameworks and vocabularies and established research and all this stuff. And so, this book is going to give you a good cross section of NDEs throughout history, even past life memories throughout history. Some of the places you've seen near-death experiences pop up in like popular culture, and then I give you a lot of the tools to discern, vocabulary around being able to discern between different kinds of experiences, because there is some nuance in there in terms of how you would take this kind of experience versus that kind of experience. And so it's kind of a distillation of some of the best things I've learned over 7 years, put into one small 208-page package.
You did. You distilled it really well. It's so easy to read and so concise. And like I said, I just sat down and read it straight through, and I could understand it really well. And it made me think this is a guidebook that I would keep next to my computer if I was watching a lot of NDEs or other types of videos, which I have to be honest, even though I've had an NDE, I don't watch a lot. I watch very few. There were a couple other questions that I wrote down. One of which I think is really important is, and some of this is, if I'm going to quote the Bible, I will say, a tell for me is, you will know a Jesus follower by his fruit. You'll know what happens when somebody dies and meets Jesus and comes back. You'll know them by their fruit. Because my experience wasn't all that long. It was 5 minutes. But when I came back, I was completely changed, and I wanted to follow Jesus and learn about him. I had no basis, I had no context for Jesus. So you actually you've kind of tried to give us some guidance on what is God's intention? Why the NDE? What does God intend by allowing these near-death experiences, by allowing us to basically see our future life for a brief period of time before we come back into our body?
I always like to judge these near-death experiences by the fruit you see on that person's life. You'll often see people have been dramatically transformed after their near-death experience. People who have a heavenly near-death experience often seem to be saturated in the love of God, and they just are super obsessed with telling you about Jesus. Oh, do you know Jesus? Have you met Jesus? And so my favorite story with Randy's experience is he was a corporate trainer. He used to do all these tests to help people figure out their personalities and their giftings and all this stuff. And one of them would rank kind of your empathy level, love level in one of the quadrants. And Randy always ranked in this quadrant where he wasn't very empathetic or loving before his near-death experience. After his near-death experience, he did do some level of corporate training for a time. And he took that test again and he ranked in a completely different category as being empathetic and loving. And Randy is one of the kindest, most empathetic, loving guys I've ever met. And while that's not scientific proof, like he had this dramatic personality shift. Like he connects with the world in a way very different than before his near-death experience. And then in terms of kind of the fruit on those who've had like distressing or disturbing near-death experiences would be more of a health experience. I feel like those people come back and they have this, like they're just driven to get their lives in order and get right with God. And in either case, you often find people who've had these experiences. Many of them do end up in some kind of ministry, or they're at the very least kind of evangelistic in their approach to the world. And so things that like there's just dramatic shifts from who they were before, and kind of outside of the spiritual fruit too. I mean, people tend to care about things like different things. A lot of times people end up switching jobs or careers. I mean, sometimes people, this is a negative consequence, even end up getting a divorce because it's like the spouse is married to a completely different person because they're so dramatically shifted by what they experience on the other side. In terms of why God gives these NDEs, I think on the one hand, there's the shift in the life of the experiencer. I feel like that is one intention. And then in terms of like for like myself as a non-experiencer, as a viewer, a listener, an interviewer, whatever it might be, I really feel like God's intent, big picture, is to be like, hey, I'm real. Meet me. God often shows up in these near-death experiences as Jesus or the Father or the Holy Spirit, often showing up in a way where the experiencer needs to encounter God in the way that he shows up in the midst of the experience. So I feel like part of it is to the rest of us who are looking, from the outside, is to show us that he is real. And then the other part of it too is just to show us that there is a real heaven and a real hell, that there are eternal destinations. And, one way is going to get you there and one way is not going to get you there, so to speak. I would say my theology on what gets you to either place is a little more gray than when I started. And I'm certainly not a universalist by any means. But one of the things I have noticed after interviewing people for so many years is God seems to give people every opportunity to turn to him. Like even in the midst of their accident or whatever horrible thing happened that caused their near-death experience, it's like time slows down. And like we've had people share testimonies of they're accepting the Lord as they're in the midst of their out-of-body experience, chasing their body in the ambulance to the hospital. Or, we've seen accounts where somebody is being put into their eternal place of torture in hell, and Jesus shows up or an angel shows up, and the common story is, well, your grandmother or your mother or somebody significant in their life has been praying and interceding for them for maybe many decades. And so, I would say on the other side of this, in the past 7 years, I realize God's love is a lot bigger, and the depths he will go to try to get us to turn to him and woo us to him is a lot more than I had ever realized. And so yeah, on the one hand, I think there's definitely an intention to shift the life of the actual person who has the near-death experience. But in terms of, what an outsider like me is supposed to do this story, it's supposed to make God a lot bigger and more real to me, and to let me know that heaven and hell are real, and I can go to heaven through Jesus. The other place, that's the path not through Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. I do believe, I agree with you that there are some shades of gray. I think God pursues us until we make that final choice and he can no longer pursue us. And then as C.S. Lewis says, your will, my will be done, not God's will be done, my will be done. And my father was an amazing example of that. And that was prayer that helped push him over the edge into God's hands. But I want to follow up with another question about this. Why now? Do you think NDEs are just a modern phenomenon? Do you think this has been happening for a while and we haven't been able to record it? Is it just because now we can resuscitate people? Why now?
That's another great question. Heidi, you're full of this. May be the best interview I've done so far. I do talk about in the book that near-death experience, ever since people started dying, the potential for near-death experiences has existed. The question now for us modern readers is, did anybody record it and do we have access to it? And so I did spend quite a bit of time looking for historic NDEs, ancient NDEs, and I share a range of those in the book. But NDEs have been around for thousands of years in terms of people recounting these stories, wrestling with them, trying to understand, like, what does this mean about the afterlife exactly? I think in terms of like why now for our modern age, what's interesting is near-death experiences are like the universal apologetic. Everybody wants to know what happens when they die. Everybody wants to know what's on the other side. Everybody wants reassurance about their loved ones who have already passed on. And so, we're at this time where media is ubiquitous and it's easy to share stories. And I think part of the, you alluded to maybe we're just better at resuscitating people. Practically speaking, that's what even Raymond Moody talks about in Life After Life, which is he coined the phrase near death experiences back in the 70s. Part of the reason we can have these conversations is because our technology has improved and we're heck of a lot better at resuscitating people. But just as it's easier for me to get, what I would consider more positive leaning NDEs out to the public right now, and to tell people about Jesus, it's just as easy to get, negative NDEs or other things that are maybe going to lead people away from Jesus out there. And so I feel like God has given us an opportunity at this time when we have the technology to spread these stories, these testimonies far and wide, whether it's in books, videos, podcasts, audiobooks, whatever it might be. It sort of to combat what the enemy is doing at this time. I mean, the case I make in the book is, Satan's trying to hijack these things. God's intending it for good, just like Satan did in the Garden of Eden, trying to hijack things that God had created for good to lead Adam and Eve into sin and away from God. I feel like it's the same kind of thing here, taking something that in and of itself is good, twisting it, shifting it to lead people down a dark path. And so why now? I feel like the stakes are just high. As many of our friends are talking about, it seems like, now to be fair, every generation thinks they're the last generation. But it seems like things are coming to an interesting frenzied pace on the world stage. And, if this is an opportunity to tell people about Jesus at a time when it's really critical, I think, in world history. And even more so, I mean, these experiences go cross culture, you can, it doesn't matter even what faith background or lack of faith background somebody has. Everybody wrestles with this. Everybody wonders about this. And so I feel like you could talk to just about anybody about these NDEs, and they're at least have a certain moderate level of interest, because we all got to wrestle with this because we each have an appointed time.
Yeah, we all have to wrestle with death. That's the one thing. Well, we have two things in common. We're born and we die. That's it. So we all have to wrestle with that. And death is the ultimate enemy, which, it's mortality. That's what we all face. So we all, obviously, we would all, I think we kind of lie to ourselves if we say we don't want to know. So can you give us a couple of examples of people who you think in the past have reported an NDE? And I do know that John Burke has discussed St. Paul's possible NDE. Do you have other examples that you can just call to mind that right on the tip of your tongue?
Yeah, I tried to find stuff that was kind of interesting or out of the box in the book, because I've read like 50 to 100 books in this space. So I wanted to touch on some different ground. Paul, I find particularly fascinating because he's like, yeah, I knew a guy who went to the third heaven. And so, who had things that were just unspeakable kind of thing, I don't know why Paul chooses to kind of go in the third person. And maybe it's precisely because God told him he couldn't share the things he saw. I mean, many of our friends who've had near-death experiences have been prohibited from sharing for several decades, or even sharing some of the things that they saw. And so that's certainly possible. But I think in Paul's case, because of all of that he experienced, he was shipwrecked, bitten by a snake, stoned and beaten, all these things. Like, he probably had several near-death experiences. It's very, very plausible. I think my favorite is Jonah. And I have another friend, Scott Smith. He's a Catholic guy, and he wrote a near-death experience book from a Catholic perspective, oddly at my prompting. It was funny. He's like, I got a book deal. And so I did an interview with him recently. We both dig into Jonah a little bit in the book, or in each of our respective books. And Jonah's interesting because we have this Sunday school flannel graph caricature of Jonah where we're like, oh, yes, Jonah hanging out on a raft in the belly of a whale for 3 days. And what's fascinating is if you get into like the Midrash and Jewish lore, the rabbis are wrestling with and the church fathers too, about, Jonah being digested by the whale and his flesh breaking down, like taking it very seriously, like going, there's more at work here. It wasn't that Jonah got to take a ride on a fish. Like, you're just practically speaking, he would have been resurrected. And I didn't go into this specific aspect of it in my book. Scott went into his is in terms of who Jonah was. Why was he special? Why was he significant? In Jewish lore, Jonah is the son of the widow who was resurrected by Elijah. And it goes further into that. Then he would have been trained by Elisha. And so it paints us a little bit bigger picture of Jonah as an intriguing character, as potentially somebody who was resurrected twice. Like, we don't really have anybody else in the Bible who has that kind of potential as being twice resurrected. But I feel like when you take Jonah's story from more of a near-death experience perspective as somebody who died and was resurrected, it makes God's part in the story so much bigger. And like, there's way more going on than just he hung out in a fish for 3 days and he showed up on the beach and was just decided it was time to be obedient. And so, it's some of this background I feel like brings these stories to life in a whole new way. And then another one that's interesting is John Bunyan. So Pilgrim's Progress, lots of other literature, but he's known well for Pilgrim's Progress. And he wrote extensively on heaven and hell and the afterlife. And he never said, yes, I had an NDE. When you think of the experiences he had, what it would have been like to be in prison for many years during the time that he lived, and he had other hard experiences, that he very well could have had a near-death experience. The Pilgrim's Progress is a travel narrative of somebody traveling to a celestial city, not unlike what people would share in the midst of a near-death experience. So, like, there are different people, as whether we're looking in scripture or you're looking through different things in history, where while they don't explicitly come out and say they had a near-death experience, we could kind of read between the lines, be like, wow, like where did John Bunyan get all this stuff that he shares about heaven and hell in some of his writings? And and were these all ecstatic, prophetic like experiences, or did he actually have an NDE? And I think some of these, whether we're talking about Paul or John Bunyan or people throughout history, I would assume that just like in our modern age, it's a little scary to share about a near-death experience because people treat you different. People treat you weird. It's just how people relate to you completely shifts. And like right now in our culture, to talk about NDEs is very popular and people are excited about it. I think back to like the late 90s into the early 2000s, you had a run of really big heaven books like Heaven is for Real and various stories. And then you had some that were very popular where people recanted their stories and said they lied. And then those kind of books completely fell out of favor for quite some time. And then you have John Burke's book, Imagine Heaven, kind of reopening the conversation, making the way for many more books to come out. And so, I would assume throughout history, like you would have had the same challenges of, like John Bunyan, especially like a clergyman in that age, coming out and see you died and had these crazy heavenly experiences might not be received well by everybody.
No, I would have had to write a fictional account. Like Paul, I would have had to say, I know a person, because you don't want to be thought crazy and you don't want your other teachings to be dismissed because somebody thinks you're crazy. I find what you say about Jonah quite interesting, because one of the earliest symbols of Christ followers was the symbol of the fish or the whale that swallowed Jonah, because Jonah rose after 3 days. Essentially, he was in the depths and he rose after 3 days. So oftentimes a lot of the tombs of the earliest Christians or earliest Jewish followers in Israel, their tombs have fish carved into the lintels of the post of the doorposts of the stone of the tombs, because Jonah apparently even back then sort of was considered to have been, in a sense, reborn after 3 days. So he was a symbol of Jesus' resurrection. He became a kind of a hidden symbol. of Jesus' resurrection. I did want to ask you this really interesting kind of trivial. It's a bit of trivia, and you talked. Well, actually, I have two more questions that I really want the answers to. But what is this Thomas Edison creating a phone that allowed him to communicate with the dead? Tell me about that and how you even came across this.
I heard reference to it in an audiobook I'd listened to last year. It's a fascinating rabbit hole to go down. So Thomas Edison was interviewed and said basically that he was working on this spirit phone to, try to communicate to the other side. Like he even had an event where he invited, like, I guess the news media and like practicing spiritualists to come and observe it. It doesn't seem like it worked at all.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is it kind of takes you into the age that he was a part of. Because in that late 1800s and into the early 1900s, spiritualism was all the rage. Like people were obsessively consulting psychics and mediums and having basically parties at their house and inviting people over for readings. And it was just this whole thing. And, whether that was Edison trying to capitalize on the love of spiritualism just to have a good press day, or it was him trying to compete with Nikola Tesla. So Tesla was experimenting with radio waves and thought perhaps he was hearing like the dead speak or touching the other side. And Tesla and Edison had a great rivalry. So, on the one hand, Edison could have been just trying to outdo Tesla, and maybe he had intention of trying to create this thing and was going after it. After Edison's death, there's no actual prototypes or plans or anything ever discovered for this device. But it's an interesting kind of factoid from history that you even have one of our greatest inventors of the last couple hundred years, like tapping into that place of the afterlife. And again, whether it was for attention or to one up his rival, I don't think we'll ever know. But yeah, the spirit phone. I was fascinated because I actually, Thomas Edison is one of my favorite inventors. I wrote my first ever research paper on him and have read tons of books about Edison. And so that was just a fascinating, weird happening to discuss, if you will.
Yeah, there was. I have read a number of books about sort of this culture in New England, this spiritualist culture in New England, where they would have all kinds of seances and mediums were all the rage. And it was kind of it was mostly on the East Coast, mostly in New York, Massachusetts. And I find it really interesting that they got into that. And it was spiritual, it was more spiritualism, not religious. Whereas the rest of the country didn't seem to really care about that. But I just found it interesting that you put those little tidbits, you kind of scatter those little tidbits in your book. So you get a bit of a historical context or reading, or we've always wanted to know what happens to the dead. This is nothing new.
Well, let me redirect us for a moment too. And I touched on this briefly in the book, talking about like some of the different societies and organizations that were formally organized and have like tried to study these occurrences through the years. And so you've had interesting cross sections of culture, including like some of the most prominent authors throughout history, professors, even clergymen, part of these societies and groups that were trying to make sense of it. And even some of the organizations that leaned way more paranormal, I guess, than spiritual. You have everybody trying to make sense of this. And so, I think the appeal, whether you're a pastor or clergyman to just the average person off the street, I think it just shows how wide the appeal is to try to want to understand this stuff. And that, people from all walks of life, from poor to rich to religious to not, everybody wants to understand this stuff. And so, again, I don't go into great detail, but I profile some of these different societies, talk a little bit about who are some of the interesting people that have been a part of them. Another one that's fascinating is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which most of us know for the Sherlock Holmes novels, and he wrote way more than that. But he was, in his generation, probably the biggest advocate for spiritualism. Like he even claimed that he would give up his literary fame if people could connect with all of his writings and research and thoughts on spiritualism, he thought it was that important. And so, that somebody like an author of that scale would think his spiritualism work was more important than his body of literature, which are just some of the best books ever written. And so, yeah, it isn't just like, tinfoil hat wearing crazy people discussing this stuff. It's like respected scholars, sometimes theologians, sometimes, prolific authors, people from all walks of life want to know what happens after we die.
Mm-hmm. This is true. I'm going to redirect you now, because there was a question that I skimmed over, but I really want to know, because I don't have a lot of experience with prophecy. Talk about the differences between the visions people see or the experiences people have with an NDE and then prophetic visions. The similarities, the differences. Explain those to our listeners, because even I need an explanation for prophecy.
Yes, this is something Randy Kay and I have wrestled with for the whole time we've been working together in this space. And so, to me, a little bit, this felt like throwing rocks at some of my friends, because I do life and work and ministry in the charismatic space and have for about 11 years. But it's not uncommon for people to often write in books about having these, I call them more like ecstatic experiences, like these heaven and hell experiences where, they're not sick, they're not near death, and they are taken up to heaven or taken down into hell. And one of the challenges I see in our space is, to the average reader, to them, it's not any different than your experience or Randy's experience. Like, to them, it's the same, because you both went to heaven or went to hell or whatever it might be. And I think it's important that we do distinguish between these sorts of experiences. So the prophetic experiences, I would categorize them as a spiritually transformative experience, where you may have gone somewhere in the spirit, so to speak, but it's not the same as somebody who dies and their soul crosses the veil to the other side and they have this, encounter with Jesus or whatever it might be. There could be similar things that show up, but I what we get into, where I get concerned, Randy gets concerned, and I wonder if it can just sometimes be a distraction, is you have people who will share about, well, it's kids' day in heaven, and I saw the theme park in heaven and all this kind of stuff. And again, it's very imaginative, and it's not necessarily anti-biblical or wrong, but what do we do with it? Like, it's just, I feel like it's kind of ancillary information that's not super helpful. Or, some of my friends have written about, they've had these visions. It's like, I always kind of joke, it's like they sit down for their quiet time and they just fall into heaven every day at 10 o'clock. But like seeing the mailroom in heaven where angels are, distributing this and responding to prayers. And again, it's very imaginative, and I could see how it's possible or plausible. But I think it's just important to have at least a dividing line and go, this is not the same thing as a near-death experience where somebody dies and their soul crosses over. Could we potentially learn some interesting things from the vision that person had? Yes. But I would have the same challenge on either side, where, let's weigh it against scripture. Let's weigh it against historic and Orthodox Christian teaching, and that sort of a thing. The question I challenge people with in that part of the book is, was that something that was actually meant for public consumption, like to put in a book and to share with everybody? Or is that something that was maybe for your own personal quiet time in your journal, but wasn't really meant for wide public dissemination? And so, I'm not necessarily questioning those people's motives. I'm not even necessarily saying their books are bad. I think it's just very confusing to the average reader who, this revelation of heaven or this revelation of hell or this NDE story. To the reader, it's all the same thing. And Randy and I both agree that it's important to note that there should be a distinction between the two, because they are not the same thing. And, again, like anything else, reader beware, be discerning and take in what's good, kind of spit out what's bad, so to speak. But it's just confusing. And so, like all the other places I go in the book in terms of, creating a framework to process and understand NDEs, getting into a lot of the vocabulary and words to distinguish, is to just kind of have the full tool set to go, these two things are not the same. And if I had to, again, I go back to what I said earlier about John Burke's comment to, we're not going to create the Church of Heidi Barr based on your experience, but I'm probably going to weight some of the heavenly things you saw in your experience or Randy saw in his, or for somebody who had a random, in quotes, prophetic experience. And so I'll be curious, because I some of my friends who like do a lot of prophetic ministry and see those sorts of things, they feel strongly that their experience is, just as valid as like your experience or Randy's experience. And I'm just pushing back a little, saying we have to stop acting like they're the same thing, because they're not. Like, it could be edifying and it could be good, but it's not a near-death experience. And I just want the reader or the person who watches an interview with somebody like that to be able to go, oh, this isn't the same thing as an NDE, but with how it's presented and how, it's phrased, it sounds like it's exactly the same thing. And that's just downright confusing.
Well, it would be confusing because oftentimes I could confuse, for instance, prophecy with meditation, with images that come to mind. Let's say I was doing yoga meditation, which I don't do, but let's say I did. I can imagine the similar type images or similar type images of enlightenment coming to mind. So I agree with you. We do have to be careful and remain scriptural. And as I said, I'm not part of a charismatic movement, and I don't usually listen much. I'm just not exposed to it. That's just the simple fact. But would you equate prophecy with visions? Do you think they're two separate things? Do you think they're part of each other? Let's say a spiritual vision. For example, in the Middle Ages, we had Saint Teresa of Avila, who had visions. Saint John of the Cross, or they considered to be heavenly visions. How do you look at that? Do you look at that as prophetic type visions, or how would you term that?
I think it kind of falls under the same umbrella, in the sense that people discern and hear from the Spirit in different ways. Like, some people get visions, some people get different just kind of impressions. Like, some people could see like a whole cinematic vision. Some people get an impression of an object or a word, and it can be all kinds of different things. And it would probably, for some people, it's an innate gifting that they just have. Like, it's not something they learned or whatever. Like, they've always been able to flow in that and operate in whatever that gift might be. Other people, I've gone through many different prophetic trainings through the years in this space. And so, I've learned how to give prophetic words and do different things. And, but it just looks like different things for different people in terms of, I think, how they're wired, how their mind works. And so I think it can look a little different, but I would put, those kind of, I would call them like ecstatic visions, in that same realm as prophecy. But, it would probably depend how the person receiving it interprets it and what they do with it in terms of how they might categorize it or qualify it.
So let's talk about a subject I don't like to talk about. Let's talk about Satan for a second. What is he doing in this sphere, in this NDE world, in this prophecy world, prophetic world? What is he doing? What's his goal? Let's just lay it all out there. Like I said, I don't like to talk about Satan. He's not my favorite person or angel, but go for it.
Well, and that's one of the reasons I included a whole chapter on Satan in the book. People might be surprised to find that in a book about near-death experiences, but Satan is the ultimate deceiver, and he's a liar and a murderer. I go into like, who is Satan? Where do we get Satan from? And between what we read in the Bible, church history, all the things, there's this picture painted of a high-ranking angel who falls from grace, so to speak, and a bunch of other angels come with him, and that is where we get Satan and demons from. These are fallen angels who, violated their mandate, what they were called to do. Satan seems to have some kind of jealousy, or different people say different things, but you can think of Satan and demons as fallen angels, and he's known to masquerade as an angel of light. And so when we think of those near-death experiences where people describe seeing this, what they think is God, as this, ball of light and love, could that not be Satan masquerading as God or as an angel of light? Can I tell you the mechanics of how that works for Satan or a demon to hijack an NDE? I can't. I've not done the research to figure that exact thing out yet. But all throughout history, we see Satan deceiving. I mean, or I think Job is probably my favorite example of just giving you a kind of front row seat view to Satan, asking God for permission to, bring calamity into somebody's life, and that kind of a thing. And so, I don't think most NDE books create much of a picture of who Satan is. But effectively, I say throughout the book, it's the same thing he was up to in the Garden of Eden. He deceives Adam and Eve. They violate the strict orders that God had given them. They eat the fruit. Original sin comes into the world. But it's that question of, well, did God say? I feel like it's putting a doubt and a temptation into people's hearts and minds to question what they often clearly knew God said or know God says. But that temptation of special abilities, special knowledge, all the things. And I feel like with some of these darker kind of ditches and pitfalls in the NDE space, whether it's, consulting a psychic or a medium, or, the people who have passed in pre-life memories, not unlike, somebody like you or Randy who had a near-death experience, they're often set up as, people see them as gurus, and it creates, this whole space of temptation for people to want to come to these others for special knowledge, so to speak, or for breakthrough or understanding, rather than prayer, rather than seeking God, rather than patiently pursuing a godly path for answers to the things that they're wrestling with. And so I feel like Satan's bag of tricks is not hugely diverse. Like, he's just pulling on the same stuff he's been pulling on for years because it works, and it's fairly effective. And so Satan's doing the same thing he's been doing throughout all time. This is just how I see it as manifesting in the near-death experience space.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I do find it interesting that people do think I'm the repository of secret knowledge. I'm not. The only secret I have is up front. It's God. It's Jesus. That's it. That's not a secret. It's truly not a secret. So yes, I can answer people's questions about what happened to me, and I can point them in a particular direction, but I can't grant them any special favors or boons, or I have no godlike powers. Randy doesn't either. But what's interesting to me is that your life is interesting to me, Shaun, because not only have you been involved in this world, much more involved in this world than I've been, and for far longer. And in fact, I think we met. When did we meet? 5 years ago? 7 years ago?
Yeah, probably about 6 to 7 years ago.
6 to 7 years ago. And a lot of things in your life have changed. You've had to face the death of a loved one. It's been up close and personal. Are you willing to talk about that? Do you want to talk about what happened in your life? And I would understand if you don't.
No, yeah, no. I mean, I write about it in the book, and I've shared about it pretty widely. So, for a lot of you who followed me for the past almost 3 years, my wife of about 26 and a half years passed away from brain cancer about a year ago, and it was a fascinating. It was obviously an awful journey, a hard journey. I like to figure out how things work spiritually and look back on things and why God does why He does, and so it's been intriguing to look back. I don't share this in the book specifically, but this would have probably been at this point maybe 8 years ago, 7, 8 years ago. I'm not a huge dreamer or prophetic dreamer like some of my friends are, but I had this dream where I knew Lynette was gone. I knew she was in heaven, and I was having a conversation with my children about getting remarried. And I saw a woman in the distance with blondish hair, and I was like, oh, and that was it. This was the whole context of the dream. And I don't dream about things like that. Never thought I would, Lynette and I were going to be married for 50 plus years. We got married so young and all these things. And so I just was like, well, that was really weird, God. And I wrote that down in my journal and I just kind of forgot about it. And then, you get to, 2.5 years ago and Lynette gets this terminal cancer diagnosis after having a seizure and collapsing at home, seemingly randomly one day. And so I remember that dream and I was like, oh, that's interesting. I was like, was that a warning dream? Like, what do I do with that? And so that was a fascinating part of the journey, not related to NDEs, but it's worth sharing, where it put me in this interesting posture of praying with a foot on each side of the fence, so to speak, like always praying and interceding for healing and believing for healing up until she passed on to the other side, but also praying into my future, where I'm at now with being remarried and just figuring out life with all of our children and all the things. And so, that was a real blessing to have had that dream ahead of that experience, just to be positioned in prayer in a way I probably wouldn't have been without that dream.
Mhm.
Now we get into the whole near-death experience side of this journey where, I had no want of doing ministry or working in the near-death experience space. I talk about in the book how I had an experience of living in a haunted farmhouse for a while. So I was aware of like dark sides of the supernatural. I believed in, spiritual things and that demons were real and all this stuff. But I came up in a very conservative faith circle where we were very like anti Holy Spirit and really not into all the woo woo things we saw on the charismatic side of the faith. But in God's providence, I ended up as a publicist for a charismatic publishing imprint and started working with people with NDE books and started interviewing people on my podcast and started to build a little bit of a grid for this. And then once Randy Kay and I started working together, it just blew up. And we had a bunch of videos that went viral. We saw all this ministry happening, people getting healed, accepting the Lord, their faith, finding their faith again, just from these near to experience conversations we were having with people like you and Ivan Tuttle and others. What I didn't know at the time, as we started, producing all this content and writing all these books, is God was preparing me for this journey Lynette and I were going to have. And so, throughout her journey, when her brain was still good before she was further deteriorated, she asked a lot of questions about heaven and dying and all kinds of stuff. We had a lot of discussions, and just having spent so much time in this space, I was able to answer her questions and encourage her, and just really help her to deal with like how do you come to terms with these sorts of things when you're most likely going to die. And then I share both of these in the book. She had, and this was probably about 8 months before she died, she had two different experiences that are kind of part of what we typically expect to see in a near-death experience. So one of them was she had, I believe, an out-of-body experience where one day she told me about in the night before she woke up but couldn't get my attention and talked about feeling like she was kind of above me and she could see that I was sleeping, but she couldn't, no matter what she did or said, she couldn't get my attention. Now, practically speaking, she was in a hospital bed in the living room. I was sleeping on the floor in the living room. And so it was just kind of like she really, I don't know that she could have moved well enough to have seen me even from the bed, and it was just with, how things were situated in there. And so we talked through what I thought that was, and I explained what an out of body experience was. And then she also had around that same time what I would best describe as an open vision. It didn't sound like this was while she was asleep and dreaming. She had this open vision of meeting her welcoming committee in heaven, and she sees her maternal grandparents, her father, and her older brother who had passed away when she was only 18 months old. And so again, another thing, had I not been immersed in the near-death experience space, I don't even think I would have had language to be like, I'd never heard of a welcoming party or committee before talking about this stuff. But again, something I was able to kind of process and talk through with her. And on the other side of this, like I've talked to Randy and Ivan and a few friends about like the why of this, because this was like 8 months before she died. And so it wasn't that she was, she was terminal, but she wasn't close to going home to heaven. And, they both said, they really felt like it was part of God preparing her for what was coming in the future. But big picture, there was just a real grace that, I could again answer her questions about heaven and the afterlife and what does it feel like for this and what does it look like for that. And, had I not spent the, several years previous just doing a ton of work in this space, I wouldn't have had the words, the language, the stories. Like I shared so many parts of people's testimonies that I've come to know through the years. And it was just a great comfort to her. And I'm sure you've seen, like I have, that these near death experience stories are a comfort to people who are dying or people who've
Mhm.
lost loved ones. And so, I kind of had a front row seat to seeing how this can minister to somebody, in real time. And so that's an unexpected outcome of this of working in this space. And so, but I really wanted to share that in the opening part of the book just to personalize it because sometimes it can be a little weird to be a non-experiencer working in this space.
Mhm.
And so I wanted people to really see how, working in the near-death experience publishing and media space has, made a major difference. And I feel really made what was a horrible season more tolerable both for me and for my late wife Lynette before she went home to heaven.
Yeah, it feels like in the midst of tragedy, you experienced grace and she experienced grace. As the book of Esther says, for such a time as this, you did this job, you've done this job. And it's remarkable because I do remember hearing about your wife's illness. And as a hospice nurse, I knew she didn't have much time left. And she's not alone in her visions. But most of the time when people have these visions, there's no one around to reassure them or explain them. So you were there for her, which is truly beautiful. So tell us, Shaun, when will your book be available? Where will it be available? And can't wait for the release of this book.
Well, the book releases on May 6th, 2025. So we're about 4-ish weeks or so
Yeah.
from the release when we're recording it. It'll be widely available wherever books are sold. In terms of pre-ordering it, probably the easiest place is Amazon. I know that's where many of us buy our books, but you can get it through Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, Walmart, Target, all the things that should be available for pre-order there. On release date, we'll have the paperback and Kindle editions. I believe the audiobook edition will be available about a month after the physical and ebook release. We should have a large print available at some point as well. But yeah, easiest place you can find out information. If you don't want to go to Amazon, go to NDEconspiracy.com. That'll redirect you to a page on my website where I've got links to retailers. If you're a podcaster or a content creator, I've got links to where you can request a time for an interview. If you'd like me to participate in a conference or an event or speak at your church, there's a place you can request that there. And then it just has information about the book, endorsements, all the things. So NDEconspiracy.com. But, in terms of release, May 6th, 2025, it should be available everywhere.
Well, thank you for writing this book. And like I said, I was traveling in a hotel room. I started reading it, couldn't put it down, read till 2 a.m, read the book all the way through. I loved it. Some of it's difficult in terms of in terms of material. Some of it's a little bit dark, but it makes sense, and it helps helps the reader to make sense of the NDE experience and how things can kind of get wonky when we're in the world of NDEs. So it's a great, great guidebook. Thank you so much, Shaun. And thanks for letting me hijack your podcast.
Of course. And thank you, Heidi, for accepting my strange request to take over the show. I truly appreciate it. I love the questions you asked it because what's fun about non-interviewers is they ask things that somebody who does lots of interviews don't necessarily ask. So you took me into places other interviews haven't taken me yet. But again, for all of you watching, listening, thank you for sticking with us till the end. Do your part, pre-order a copy just to help increase our rankings. That helps us get the word out to more potential readers. And again, all things book related, head over to NDEconspiracy.com. We'll have that all linked for you there. And we'll see you again soon for a future episode of the Shaun